I think the soul and accessing this information, it lies deep in our body, in our what I would call our true nature, and really understanding and seeing ourselves as part of mystery. If we were to zoom out, way out, and look at the planet, or even look in under a microscope, right? We're amazed by life. We're amazed by this newborn baby. We're amazed by these cells and things. Or we look at things from a very broad perspective, like, whoa, look at this part of the planet. I see us as just one expression, one aspect, one flower, one rock formation, one thing that is part of this living planet. It's just that we're so confused. I feel like this is what's special about us and our egos, that we just think we're separate and we have all this control and can dominate and separate from that. So in terms of who we truly are, if we don't have this ego part dominate, is finding that mystery within ourselves.
Welcome to Be Human, Loraine.
I'm thrilled to be here.
I'm so excited for this conversation. You and I already have connected about some very similar beautiful experiences in our life. Where I want to start with you is, I know that you were born and raised near the edges of the Amazon rainforest in Suriname, which just to me just provides a spectacular image in my mind. Can you share more about that experience in your life and how that began to lead you into your development of coming home to yourself?
Absolutely. I still reflect so much on that experience, even though I moved to the US 40 years ago when I was 13 years old. And, as a child, you're very prone to taking things for granted because there it is all around you. And yet I remember, even as a child, not fully taking things for granted. I still be, like driving with my parents, maybe half an hour in or so, a little bit further into the rainforest, because they had about 4 acres of land and we called it boiti, which means kind of outside, like your little vacation spot. There was nothing on it. It was just a hut and um just like the lawnmower and tools and my boots and stuff. So nothing much to it, but it was our vacation space where my parents would do some farming and stuff like that. And I do remember being in awe. I do remember, like, wow, if you saw little monkeys around or crocodiles or any of that wildlife or butterflies, and feeling just really free. And I believe that those experiences and my parents allowing us to just wear these oversized boots and have this rusty machete and just go out and roam around. I believe that those experiences really helped ground me during the wake, which was very different. Even though it was a third world country, there was stress, kind of the kind that you would imagine Mowgli go through, who I related to, kind of already, like knowing the human sort of dynamic and stressors. My mother was a principal and could get stressed out because of all the to-dos and kind of her regimented way of being. So I would then want to escape, even when we were back in the city, to the little patches of uncultivated land and very quickly grown in forest like. And me as a little kid, like playing around and trying to experience that same sense of freedom and coming back to myself, why I was upset, and already you're very intuitive and trying to unpack what was wrong with the picture. So I believe that are my early experiences of being my true self, and how my environment and this rich nature around me impacted me.
With everything that you know now, what do you feel is or was wrong with the picture back then?
Yeah, so everything I know now, I would look at it through a lens of the ego, what we just talked about, how no matter where we live, even in a place that I believe was quite spiritual. There were a lot of ancient cultures and all of that. I was just like bees to honey.
Yeah.
Other relatives and friends and cousins maybe would not have paid that much attention, but it was my calling, my thing. So I would like really center around that. And I think it activated my soul and perhaps even the part of myself that I believe now um, was brought in from a past life and this wisdom. And so that would backlight what was happening. And I was
Mm,
able to already understand the ego and how
mm.
it functioned and sort of this persona, this mask, this conditioned way of being in the matrix, if you will.
Yeah.
And the ways I would, I guess, analyze it, if it was aligned or not, was through the elements and with the help of this, what I now do is a tree guide and a soul sanctuary. But the sense of this is my true nature, and these are patterns on top of that, similar to what my parents and others would do to get power, to get recognition, to get money, to get, I all saw it like for a ulterior motive that was important, that was survival based, but not in tune with what having some Chinese ancestry too, like this alignment of the elements I quickly learned, and it intuitively made sense. So what I saw is my mother's fire and her earth like being too hot and too fierce and not grounded enough, being rigid in terms of ground, but not grounded enough. And then my father being too airy and too watery and too much of a peacemaker. So I would intuitively see things from that perspective. And we also had a housekeeper of maroon background that's African descent, runaway slaves basically. And from my mother's side, I do have some of that ancestry. And I felt a deep, deep connection with this other human in the
Mm,
house. And she would speak very little, but when she did, it was this, sort of soul connection.
yeah.
And that's what felt real to me. So I would use all of these experiences to um, interpret like all of these different layers of culture and religion and exposure. My parents also both having studied abroad in Europe saw the impact of that and all the
Mm,
cultural nuances in a very rich multicultural society, the status and the different dynamics. I was already interpreting all of that. So
yeah.
the ego I saw as the part of the self that wasn't aware of itself and
Mm,
how it was getting entangled into all of these dynamics and surviving and not really asking if this survival was in the best interest of the true self.
yeah. Yeah, I'd love to explore that more with you.
Mhm.
By the sounds of it, you're speaking to the ego is there to help us survive.
Mhm.
What is it helping to survive if not for the soul or the being or the essence of who we truly
Yeah,
are?
those are really wonderful and deep questions. And something I sat with a lot, having had training and my schooling in clinical psychology, but then also steeped in esoteric studies, Buddhist
Yeah.
psychology, and that sort of thing. So you often hear in spiritual circles that we need to kill the ego.
Mm.
And interestingly enough, when I went deeper in my Taoist background, I was kind of like, I was kind of delighted because it's like, oh, they don't believe in killing the ego either. That's more Buddhist. They believe in
Yeah.
aligning the ego. So I see
Mm.
the ego more as like kind of the driver in the car. And if you don't realize what kind of car you inherited and you're 16, you're just all really excited. It's like, oh, freedom now. I don't care if there's like oil leaks in the driveway and my wiper's not working when it rains hard and the door doesn't close right and the brakes screech right. You're just gonna be like, whoa, it's all on me. But then when you go through the journey in life and maybe you need to go to different destinations and different places, maybe end up last, maybe getting lost, maybe all these other things happen because you need to deal with all the problems under the hood and whatnot. You're going to end up coming up with a story about the ego. and blame the ego and think I'm not good enough, what's wrong with me, I'm not smart, I'm this, I'm that, I'm the other. So that is kind of the ego not aware of patterns and things it inherited. And the ego, we do need that ego to help us succeed and drive and get from A to B and do all the different things, to have a body to support our soul and the purpose we have in this life. But it really behooves us to know what parts of our experience and our feelings and the data we're getting we over identified with and think it's just the ego, and we need to do more self-improvement on the ego.
Mm.
You can improve your driving skills all day long, but if it's under the hood, the engine, and the wrong road you keep on going in this like crooked thing, well, there's a shortcut that everybody takes, right? Then it's not going to help. So that's what I see a lot, where people need to understand the ego and align more. That actually means like firing the ego from positions, or like
Mm.
retreating, pulling the ego out of entanglements and really looking at things and learning skills and taking a whole other approach that they're not used to.
Mm.
Maybe like under looking under the hood through meditation, through accessing sometimes embodied short-circuited aspects of the self that are numbed out, that are not accessible, and you really have to dig up things a little bit to even get that information of
Mm.
what kind of car you inherited. So I hope that metaphor makes some sense of
It
like how
does.
I see the ego and partnering with the ego.
So in aligning our ego with our soul, how do we know what our soul is? Or maybe a better question would be, how do we reconnect with this?
Yeah. So that is a huge, big question. What even is the soul, right? So I am very experiential in my learning, and even though looking at numerology and something I'm fascinated with and just newly um, came into my life, there's an aspect of myself that's very much a seven. It's a seeker of truth and knowledge, and so I'm very much like wanting to understand things on a heady intellectual level. But I do remember throughout my whole journey, especially when having spiritual epiphanies, that I on purpose, like I don't want to know anything about it, or I was most amazed that I would download information that I had
Wow.
never read about, and then read about this particular
Mm.
spirit guide or ancestor or whatever, right? So I think the soul and accessing this information, it lies deep in our body, in our what I would call our true nature,
Mm.
and really understanding and seeing ourselves as part of mystery. If we were to zoom out, way out, and look at the planet, or even look in under a microscope, right? We're amazed by life. We're amazed by this
Yeah.
newborn baby. We're amazed by these cells and things. Or we look at things from a very broad perspective, like, whoa, look at this part of the planet. I see us as just one expression, one aspect, one flower, one rock formation, one thing that is part of this living planet. It's just that we're so confused. I feel like this is
Mm.
what's special about us and our egos, that we just think we're separate and we have all this control and can dominate and separate from that. So, in terms of who we truly are, if we don't have this ego part dominate, is finding that mystery within ourselves, how it lives in our body, as an ecosystem, as this brilliance, this huge mind, this amazing life-giving energy and force. And it has this unique expression in our body. And it also has this unique human component in terms of
Mm.
how do we then work with the ego? A story of this separation or whatever happened that enticed us, that maybe was necessary for us to survive as
Mm.
humans. Maybe we would not have been able to beat the elements and whatnot, through the ice ages or whatever ages. But I think coming back in alignment with it, it's the story of liberation, and
Mm.
not again like free floating, but in alignment with liberation from these shackles of these misgivings, and then finding our deepest connection back with our true nature and these laws of nature, and not feeling oppressed or held back by that, but feeling fortified, but also very respectful. That is something I remember as a child, and being with this maroon person in our house, how baffled she was, how little respect sometimes, my parents and have had when we would go into the rainforest, and not be like, my parents would see it as superstition, but she would see it as like, you would have to pray to the water goddess, Mama, and like hold things with much more respect, because you're going into this amazing like force that,
Mm.
where you're defenseless in some ways, too. So I saw it more as a surrendering, not necessarily as a fear, but a proper fear, I guess, for this immensity that lives outside of us, but also for that lives inside of us. The amount of self-loathing and the lack of self-respect is not even like, oh, love yourself and get your nails done and whatever, right? It's like love, like respect, like surrender to this force that lives inside of you. It's just
Mm.
as immense as the Grand Canyon or whatever thing you think it's amazing. So that's to me what living in alignment with
Mm.
the ego and the soul means.
If this is our true nature,
Mm.
why do you think we have so much resistance to surrendering to that sense of liberation?
I think that what's so interesting as a psychologist and also as a healer, what I see and looking at the ancestral patterns, I do believe that once we started to have our smarts come more online,
Mm.
and we knew how to hog resources, and we knew how to fight who we thought was the enemy and get ahead. And like I said, who knows, maybe some of that we needed to really survive and still be here, and some of that may have been able to have happened if we had figured out how to be more harmonious. But once I believe our ancestors got attacked and hurt and traumatized and vengeful and all of that, then this back and forth pattern happened, which is then an implosion explosion pattern of energy, of this emotionality, human emotionality that doesn't flow through our ecosystem like water flows in this very balanced and sacred way, bringing nutrients and detoxing. This emotions are to do giving information and wisdom. It was sort of doing its own thing over this body that it was a trauma body, and just like becoming then hyper vigilant, defensive, attacking, offensive, defensive, right? This implosion, explosion pattern. And because of that, we often feel falsely empowered and completely
Mm.
deluded. We don't think we're not free or liberated. We think we're on
Yeah.
top of the world and we are free, and we're like, like they're not free. The people are shackled and struggling and not surviving, don't have the resources, the money, the this, the that to rise to the top of the ladder. But we
Mm.
can't see the whole game, right? We can't see that we're all shackled or all like sucked into the game that keeps us all captive.
Mm.
So it's again the ego that can completely confuse us. And unless we go underneath that and get more clarity, that we don't even know what we're doing most of the time.
Yeah. And you speak to ancestral wounds or intergenerational trauma.
Mm,
And I know you work certainly in this realm of healing.
mm,
How do we begin to heal ourselves from such trauma?
mhm. It's really tricky, because my paradigm, one that I use in my book as well, I'm kind of chuckling because I'm thinking of Shrek, the movie. I don't know if you know,
Yeah.
but how he compares us to onions, and I'm like, I wonder if Shrek really influenced this model
Yeah. How
subconsciously,
did Shrek get
maybe.
into this depth of wisdom?
But in sociology and other fields, yeah, they talk about these circles of influence, and you can
Mm,
think of it as our own inner circle, and then your family, and maybe your neighborhood, school, work, friends, so on and so forth. And when you go way out there, you have planetary world events, ancestral influences, right? Because we're all living in a certain context and in time and place.
mm.
So to say that, okay, we're going to do this in very chronological, orderly manner, we're going to start with the inner circle and then move our way up. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
And developmentally, in developmental models in clinical psychology, you hear of the same thing. You can kind of think of these circles as stages like kindergarten, elementary school, middle school, and whatnot. So if you have like, let's say mathematics or language, the alphabet, or some places where you did not get the full education and you have some holes, it might show up later, right, in high school, or you can kind of notice that limb. So when we're older now, to say where do you even start, and when you try to approach it from a heady level, yes, you could start way at the beginning and look at the holes and fill that up. But most of the time, we're not fully aware, right? Because of like that driver. We have this limp and you're like, oh, what's wrong with me? Why can't I just be like that and have this beautiful, graceful walk? Or, right, you're
Yeah.
not even understanding. But we can start with whatever is irking us, whatever comes up in our current relationship. Most likely it's going to be with loved ones, or at work with bosses and coworkers, or with children, or it's going to be in relationship with ourselves, right?
Yeah.
So there you're going to have some activation. And a lot of times anxiety, depression are two big umbrella heads, but in terms of emotions, you might have anger, sadness, despair, powerlessness, fear, and just go with that. So what I do when I lead my clients one-on-one or through my course, sometimes they have immediate insight, like, oh my gosh, I learned that from my dad who got
Wow.
that from grandpa, and
Right.
so they're immediately in the ancestral. And what I say, that might all very well be true, but once we have now some awareness, I do think this orderly fashion and approaching things from the bottom up and looking at the foundation is going to help, so that when you're working at this higher level, it's not going to collapse all in. So the foundational level would be, let's look at your earliest childhood, or what may have happened in your life, even if there may be some past life or some ancestral influencers and whatnot amplifying it. Let's just
Mm,
look at what happened when you were a little kid and we're subjected to that, and start with the mindset of that younger self, because we are so layered and complex that even though our adult self is very clear of mind, sometimes when you feel like, gosh, I got possessed or something, or the rug got pulled, and where did I fall into? Oh my
yeah.
God, I can't even think clearly. That is the younger self. And if it's a 2-year-old or 15-year-old, I don't know if you remember those ages, or parents who have those kids those ages, they're difficult. And our younger self at those ages are just as intense and
Yeah.
just as challenging. They're all embodied in their energy. So if we can retrieve those younger selves and heal them and bring them into the sanctuary where you really are in that soul authority, and you're
Mm,
reorganizing things and have the different rules of behavior, clarity, alignment, then you're not going to be overtaken by those younger selves driving the bus and driving the car when you don't want them to. Right? You're going to be working in alignment with your own ego, split ego selves, falsely empowered child ego selves, even where the
Mm.
adult self now has to align with some of these splinters and keeps retrieving them and aligning them to this new paradigm, this new program. So that's what I recommend doing. And once that is solid, then you're maybe able to expand out and start looking at like maybe experiences you had in high school or middle school, then become clear how these dynamics, it's like, okay, it's still bothering me. This must be the impact of my mother or father, on me, and this ancestral thing that is still like a splinter in my finger. It's small, but yet it can consume my whole consciousness.
Mm.
It's weird. Kind of that's how ancestral issues kind of feel. So then you have much more control over your body yourself, but you still like, okay, I think it's my job to work on this level. And because I've worked on it on all kinds of levels, I really know this is the ancestral level. So then there's other techniques where we separate the energy of, we do soul part exchanges and put the energies of the ancestors in their own sanctuaries, do the whole healing, and you're not, as the driver, taking blame for all of those um, symptoms or things that might be happening.
Can you share how this plays into not working with just the symptoms, but actually getting to the core of what is happening?
Yes, and those are excellent questions. So the reason I'm also chuckling a little bit because you're just hitting the right on the nail on the the nail on the head. The reason why I started to have some problems in my clinical psychology training and expanded further out was because the ego, especially the younger, falsely empowered selves, tend to be fundamentalist, and they
Mm.
really see things black, white, good, bad, and one they have, when you think of symptoms and how we think, right, of symptoms as bad, their agendas are get rid of all these bad symptoms and make me feel good and make me.
Yeah.
So I was like, everybody was like learning how to do this to help your client. I'm like, and I was like, there's even a problem with this game,
Yeah.
with this setup, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm agreeing to this, that the symptom is bad and they're good, and without that they're right. So it was really discombobulating, because
Mm.
here you are learning as the rookie in this system with these experts, and nobody was calling this out. So I had my first major initiation, like, I don't know, but my intuition is saying this is not right.
Yeah,
And
I
I go
agree.
back out and do my own thing. And I was terrified. It was 3 years in, terrified I was going to get in trouble because my intuition was going in a whole different direction, which I
Wow.
now realize is wholeness, right? Like, no, we can't even trust that goal that the client wants. Yet you're learning to be client centered. And
Mm.
so, how do I resolve this dilemma? I didn't know like what, but then of course the universe gave me clients who were on that page and they loved it and they
Mm.
ate it up. And so here I felt like I am doing something totally unethical, totally like being grandiose and having a personality disorder, diagnosing myself because I am challenging the authority. I was also labeled as having authority issues. So that's how soul authority was born, because I reframed it all. It's like, I maybe don't have authority issues. Maybe I'm trusting a deeper sense of authority. And yes, I need a system of checks and balances, but you're not it. I know clearly that what you're teaching me is not a
It's
good
not in the
system.
DSM.
So that's how then I started to rely on the elements and working with them and my own connection with nature and the earth, kind of like
Mm.
seeing myself, no, we're underneath there's this harmonizing principle, and then there's the weather, and you can have storms and fires and all the different things that are happening, and those symptoms are not the problem. Earth is trying to harmonize that. They're just expressions of a deeper problem. So if we shut that down, if we had a pill to shut down wildfires, I'm sure people would be all in line, like, get that pill. But,
Yeah.
there's another group of people saying, no, it's telling us what we all need to do on a deeper level, these floods, these things. So there was a part that just intuitively understood that. And it's like, I
Mm.
need to find some school or some program that will endorse that.
Mm.
And that's how I became an integrative psychologist. And now I call myself an eco psychologist and honor that. And I'm happy to say in the past 25 years, where this was so weird and so woo and so that, we've come a long way, that it's
Yeah.
not even that strange anymore. Eco psychologists might still be like, what does that mean? And what do you do? But when I explain it and be the bridge and like showing how that all works together and how we have inner climate denial and also ignore personal warming signals and don't even know how our ecosystem works with elements, and say that is what's happening on the planet is a direct reflection of that, people tend
Mm.
to intuitively get it, and I can explain more. So this is how I see symptoms in this whole big larger context, as just doorways to information and
Mm.
wisdom.
Yeah. Beautiful. I love it. In relation to soul authority, is this something that is the same for everyone, or do people have different expressions of it?
Oh, I love um the idea of soul authority, what it means, because you can also spell it. I love plays on words. So you can think of it also as SOLE, right?
Mm.
And your own soul, your soul that's unique, but also soul. It is totally unique. Yet at the same time, I also love that there's a universality
Mm.
behind it, because in my own journey, my career path, there was, before I knew the answer and where I wanted to end up, there was a good period of time, 5 to 10 years, first as a hardcore researcher of multicultural psychology and spirituality, and then doing the diversity programs in very intense US, around all these difficult topics, even with students and the police and people from all different ethnic backgrounds. And while I loved that, and I was really good at helping people communicate their differences and hold space and understand safety guidelines, it wasn't fulfilling enough, because it wasn't showing to me the commonality. At the same time, I did not want wasn't in agreement with any of the color blindness. Oh, we're all the same. It was paradoxical, and that was
Mm.
what my dissertation even was about. Like, what if people have a paradoxical mindset where you can be at some level very much the same, and yet your story is very unique, and it's not even, sometimes you hear, well, yeah, we're so different, let's match client with therapist, and you have a similar background. I'm all for that. I understand that, but I'm like, honestly, all my clients had the biggest issues with their parents and their siblings and community who are the same, supposedly. So it's more complicated than that. Just
Yeah.
because you have a similar background doesn't mean you're right, completed the heart the same. So there was something in my culture where this equanimity, this broad-mindedness of this paradoxical thinking, how you could be similar and different, all that I wanted to infuse in soul authority. And that's why we start soul authority with the tree, because the tree, the sacred tree, embodies all of that complexity, paradox, this, seen and unseen, dark, light, good, bad, and the
Mm.
seasons of death, rebirth. I'm like, I got to start the ego there and align the ego, or at least show the ego how much is missing the mark. And then partnering with the part that is feeling in alignment, and then we can have shared goals
Mm.
that we can both work on, and it doesn't feel like I'm in a power struggle with them. So I sometimes joke, I said, I have a 10-week course just to court your ego and partner with your ego before we can get started.
Yeah.
But no, that's a joke. I mean, people like drop in and get it often very soon, as at least the people who feel attracted to work with me. But yeah, soul authority is getting to what we have in common, which is we breathe oxygen. Our body temperatures are pretty the same all over the world, plus or minus a few degrees, like in terms of the blood that flows through us, and water. But other than that, the stories and how we figure all of that out, and what we need to balance ourselves and liberate ourselves, are very unique. But the onions, surprisingly, the onion layers tend to also have a similar, they're like, oh my gosh. And then people go around like, oh, what you said about that. And I can totally relate to each one of you, but here's where I'm at, right? That is a very common thing. And my people now are from all over and all ages, often from the late teens all the way to the 70s, sometimes every decade represented, every color and gender, and you can imagine. And it just delights my heart to see so much diversity. I feel like I'm scuba diving and just looking at like all this beautiful coral and fish and all this diversity, and yet there is a cohesiveness.
And what is soul authority? How does it look like practically? If we were to sort of begin exploring this idea of living in alignment with it, where is a good place to start for people?
The good place to start is kind of what I was saying. Where's that pain point? Where's that irk? Where's that trigger? And if you start going a little deeper, guess what you find? A fundamentalist, younger, falsely empowered.
Okay, that's not where many people are going to want to go, Loraine.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, it's not me directing you there.
Yeah,
but if you
I understand.
if
where you got to go.
To go under the hood, you could keep driving. That's called what we call blind action. We're gonna go the other way. And then but do you want to spend all that energy driving around and say, oh my gosh, that's the same loop I did 20 million times? Or do I want to look under the hood? So if you now look under the hood, you're most likely gonna find some kind of fundamentalist wounded self from somewhere, even if it's ancestry, even if it's from past life, funnel it down to the expression it has in this life. For example, in mine, I had all this persecution fear. I literally, and I have people who tell me this, like, I don't know where this is coming from, but I think I'm going to get in trouble. I'm going to go to jail. I'm going to lose my daughter. And what is it about? Like something we're just grasping to put context to. It's like in my situation, it was because I didn't know what I was doing. I'm working with vulnerable clients and they're going to complain, and I have no education in this field, and the board of psychology is going to come after me, throw me in jail, I'm going to lose my kid. So so there's some truth to that, some of that tension happening, but it had the roots in a past life where I was identified by somebody. It was in the Middle Ages of France, and I was called a witch. And even though I was dragged off and killed, this was probably part of the ego dynamic I had to work through in this life, because there was a part that was really audacious, like, go ahead, you can't kill me, I'm light, and this and that. And other part just completely devastated, understanding the impact of that on my children and feeling terribly guilty, right? So these clients were now my children, and my audacity was going to cause them harm, and I was going to end up in jail. So even though it makes sense in this life, kind of, there's some situation and pattern, and even if you know it has some older roots, still resolving it, in this life, and separating these energies can really hold the ego at bay a bit and have your soul authority, your wisdom, that's maybe a more common term that you could use, be online, or your adult self that is connected to some sort of checks and balances and guidance, and drive the bus. You can still be the one driving the bus and saying, I hear you screaming, tantruming young child, but you don't get to drive the bus. We're going to stop, we're going to attend to you, but it's not safe. So that's kind of what it would look like in terms of an inner experience. What it would look like with a partner is that you might, not continue screaming or upset or barging off, and say, okay, let me just take a moment, retreat, and find myself At work, it might look like, instead of hiding and being convinced that you have nothing to say or you should not stick your neck out, or as a leader that everybody knowing how powerful you are, all of that could start looking a little different. And you can start understanding, whoa, this is a triggered state. This is an emotion of a younger self trying to prove himself. And that is more ego driven than I'm comfortable with, or you might outgrow it at some point. It's falsely empowered. It's not empowering. It's actually very scary and risky what I'm doing, because I'm threatening, I'm risking relationship, job opportunities, whatnot.
And coming back to sort of where we started, like about true nature and self,
Mm-hmm.
are there characteristics that we can become aware of that may be sort of a guiding post to whether we are connected with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I tend to, and by no means is this the all-encompassing definition, but when I take my clients to meditations, and sort of we take a tour, in the self and all the parts of the self and the ego, and when I say, okay, this is your true nature, it's really when they're sitting with the tree, they're connecting. I even have a saying, it's time to center and retreat through our crown and our feet, where as above and so below meet. So they're connected because your own ego and sense of self, even if you're peaceful, organic, I kind of see it as a pool of water that's not connected to the waterways. And as a child, we always learn that is dangerous, toxic. Things grow in there. Make sure it's connected to water, flowing water, right? So I see myself that way. If you're not connecting to a tree that symbolizes all of life and how that all circulates through us, there's still something off. To me, that even if it's peaceful, calm, it's not truly my true nature. So my true nature has this sense of flowing and connection and being connected to something big. And it also has this sense of stillness and movement, kind of like the trunk of the tree. The whole tree seems very still, but then suddenly you realize, whoa, there's so much happening. But it's not like the movement and the thing that the ego is usually dominated with, which is the to-do list and what I got to do next and this and that and what I got to prove my worth and did I finish this and then right? There's like nothing sort of to do. You're completely sort of in your being and regulating health and regulating flow of energy and noticing how the breath supports that in your food, and kind of animal like, I feel. And then on top of that, we can still have our human expression and all the amazing things we build and imagine, but we can backlight it and sort of look at it through fresh eyes and say, okay, all that is wonderful. I love chocolate. I love all the, all the different things I get to experience, beautiful music, this and that. But let's look at the whole production of that. Is it in alignment with how I feel when I'm in my true nature? Or if I go through the motions of that, does it totally feel like it's an ego dominant thing of, yeah, you're successful, that's beautiful, and you get all this rewards and money and this and that? That suddenly feels very jarring, right? So then it doesn't feel. So there's many things that we've created and we do that could be totally in alignment, and we have to streamline and shave off and adjust the things that are not. So that's how I start with the tuning. I also sometimes say to my people, I know you've learned to rewire yourself and to the mind. And while that is all a very helpful and powerful tactic, what I found is the mind just, even if it's the most expansive, as a default, it's much more limiting and limited than wisdom that comes from the body and mystery up and the soul and the inside up. So I kind of want to just stop that and then have you rise, sort of up from the bottom. And then when you get clarity of what it is that you need to say, whether it is I'm amazing, beautiful, magical being, it has this other more expansive meaning that connects to the below experience, which is different than sometimes people learn how to use affirmations, where it's like, oh,
Right.
I'm just so ugly and bad and I'm dumb. And they're like, oh, you're a smart person. Look at all these beautiful things and things you said. And okay, all right, I'm gonna look in the mirror and say I'm a smart, beautiful,
It
it's
doesn't land.
just, it is the rewiring, right?
Yeah.
Like for some people it works, but I'm
Yeah.
saying if it doesn't, it's probably a powerful
Deeper.
energy from underneath that wants you to be more of that first, in a even
Mm.
like languageless state of understanding and knowing.
Mm.
And then you sort of attract language, but don't hold on too tight to it or get too
Yeah.
attached, because it's just right, it might expand or it might drop for the wayside, and another word might be invented to better capture your experience.
Beautiful. Thank you for such a wise conversation, Loraine. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for your questions. I really enjoyed and the presence and just you holding space. I can feel, I'm I'm intuitive, so I can feel all the tantalizing little cells. Like they're like, yeah, get to talk, and not in every conversation. So you're very much, we're a big part of that coming out. So thank you. Appreciate it.
On a final note, I would love to ask you, Loraine, what does it mean to you to be human?
Wow, yeah, I know you probably have to think about that one because it's so big. I'm like, holy Moses, how do you answer this question? So to me, to put it in a nutshell, it's really like understanding that in our being and in this mysterious, especially our body, underneath the usual busy mind, there are these treasure chests and these parts just to keep on excavating. And I guess it's more of not answering it necessarily, but trying to give hope and encouragement to people who feel overwhelmed or feel sort of like, I can't, that's too painful, too hard. That there are ways to soothe the self, there are ways to ground and decharge the intensity, because it's not meant to be that way. It's meant to be just this beautiful journey of discovery. And even if you're good at it and do it like every day diligently, by the end of your life, you will have uncovered a little fraction of what it means to be human. I guess that's the best I can do.